Buonasera a tutti, a tutte, buon pomeriggio, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome, benvenuti, benvenute al nostro incontro. Mi chiamo Teresa Fiore, I'm Teresa Fiore, I'm a professor at Montclair State University. Sono una docente presso la Montclair State University. E comincio con delle istruzioni tecniche. I'm going to start with technical instructions. Questo è un incontro bilingue. This is a bilingual conversation, and we will be using interpretation. Questo è un incontro in due lingue e avremo la traduzione simultanea. La maggior parte dell'evento è in inglese, the majority of the event will be in English, con due parti in italiano, with two parts in Italian. Mi rivolgo adesso a chi parla italiano. Scegliete dal menu in basso l'icona del mappamondo che dice interpretazione e scegliete l'inglese per la traduzione simultanea. Ascolterete due voci, la mia in più bassa e quella più alta di chi traduce. Potete anche togliere la mia cliccando su silenzia audio originale. Cliccate su disattiva se volete sentire solamente la voce dei relatori direttamente. For those of you who speak English, when we have Italian, you can use interpretation into English by clicking on the icon that says interpretation. Click English for the language that you need. You're going to hear two voices, the one of the speaker and then the one of the interpreter on top at a higher volume. If you only want the interpreter, click mute original audio. And if you just want to hear the original voice of the speaker, just click off. I hope I've covered all. Spero di avere illustrato tutto. Grazie per esservi uniti a questa avventura bilingue. Thank you for joining us for this bilingual adventure. Hopefully we won't be lost in translation. Speriamo di non perderci in questa traduzione. Bene. Continuiamo, next slide. Next slide again. Another piece of technical information, the chat is there for you. If you have a technical issue, we can address it in writing. And the Q&A will take place at the very end of the event, but you can add your questions at any moment during this conversation. We won't be able to have all the questions shared with the group. We'll do our best, but you can always be in touch with us after the event. So this is an event with many languages because it has a multiple geography. We have speakers located in Italy, in the US, obviously, and the UK, and we have a pretty global audience of, I'm very pleased to tell you, over 100 people. Thanks for being with us. Thanks, of course, first of all, to the panelists, the speakers, and thanks to all of you who are joining us from all these countries and probably many more. This is all made possible by Lydia Rosenberg behind the scenes, who's the magician with Zoom. But of course, it's made possible by our two interpreters who are going to go back and forth between English and Italian, Maria Galetta and Lilia Pino-Bluen. This event of today, the Taste of World War II in Italy, is part of a series of events that we're able to offer at Montclair State University on a very regular basis, normally once a month. We usually do it in person, but since the pandemic, we've been doing it online, which has meant that we've become even more transnational than we used to be. These events are possible thanks to the support of a generous family, the Inserra family, in particular, Mr. Larry Inserra, who's also on the board of directors on our campus. But this time, we also extend our thanks to the Kali family, and we'll mention them later on. This fund, this endowment was created for the promotion of Italian language, Italian culture, but with a particular twist, that is to say, by looking at how Italian culture travels with its people, with its ideas, with its products, as part of a transnational vision. And it means that our events, which have been offered, I'm pleased to say, for a decade now, so hopefully we can celebrate actually in the fall, who knows if in person, they have been also transdisciplinary, because knowledge does not belong to any discipline in particular. And another characteristic is that they've always been collaborative. They have entailed many forms of partnership. In particular, this time, these are the different associations and units that we're working with. Of course, we're linked to the Italian program. I'm a faculty member in that program in the Department of World Languages and Cultures. We're collaborating for obvious reasons, given that we're talking about food with the Nutrition and Food Department. We're collaborating with the History Department, given that, of course, we are particularly focused on the history of food this time. And we're partnering up with an association based in Licata, in Sicily, by the name of Memento. So as you can see, we try to work within the academic world as well as outside of it. Today's topic, I think, exemplifies perfectly well what I just described to you. The taste of World War II in Italy, international tensions and local solutions for food supplies is an opportunity to talk about a topic that brings together indeed history and food, as we were saying. It brings together different methodologies, as we will see, from the archives to the oral interviews. And it is particularly transnational in the sense that it looks at a conflict, which was international by definition, and it focuses in particular in the second part on the encounter between Sicilians and by extension, of course, Italians and the Allied troops, and in particular, the American soldiers. The event is a two-part event. We're going to have a lecture by our distinguished guest speaker, Lizzie Collingham. And her lecture will be followed by the presentation of an ongoing project here at Montclair State University, which I have the pleasure of coordinating and which I have designed based on a broader research that I will tell you about in the second part of today's event. Of course, the subject of World War II has been covered by a really vast body of literature, both scholarly and creative, films, novels, memoirs. But the lens of food is quite new. And we are quite pleased to have indeed Lizzie Collingham with us, because she brings this specific interpretive lens to this world conflict, not as a marginal topic, but really as a central engine to understand how the war worked, as you will hear in a few minutes. It is also a novel take in the sense that, as you will see in the second part, a subject that can be researched with the archives, but also away from them by using literary sources and by using oral history, the video interviews which we will share with you in the second part. The third novel aspect of today's conversation is that of proposing a repositioning of the geography of World War II by making a place which is by definition a periphery into the focal point. Robert Gordon has written that Sicily is a place where the end of the war begins. And indeed, as we will hear from the next speaker, indeed that the beginning of the end of the Axis control of European territories ends in small villages of the southern part of Sicily, as well as on the eastern coast. Today's program then has different voices, and I'm going to quickly go over them, mostly so that you know what language they're going to speak, and when you have to click on the icon of the globe in order to get the translation, the simultaneous translation. We're going to have two sets of introductory remarks in English and Italian. The lecture will be in English. My presentation of the project will be in Italian, and then some comments at the end by Kenneth Browne will be in English, and the debate will also be in English, but please remember that you can actually write your questions in Italian, and I can translate them. To our first speaker then, Jeff Strickland, who is the chair of the history department with which we're collaborating, is a professor of history, author of Unequal Freedoms, Race, Ethnicity, and White Supremacy in Civil War Era Charleston, and a forthcoming book titled All for Liberty, the Charleston Workhouse Slave Rebellion of 1849. He teaches courses on race, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, and today he will provide us with a historical context for the subject that we're addressing. Thank you for being with us, Jeff.
Thank you, Teresa. Hello, welcome to Montclair State University and the lecture, The Taste of World War II in Italy, International Tensions and Local Solutions for Food Supplies, by Lizzie Collingham. Please let me begin by thanking Teresa Fiore for organizing this wonderful event and for inviting the history department at Montclair State University to co-sponsor it. I also want to thank Lizzie Collingham for sharing her expertise. The topic of food in World War II is undoubtedly a popular one, as evidenced by today's attendance. War is one of the most written about history topics in the United States. Food is an important topic in the history of the American Civil War. Historians emphasize the foraging that armies resorted to when food and other supplies ran low or were non-existent, and the civilian and military deaths from gastrointestinal diseases. Events such as this talk by Lizzie Collingham are critically important to preserving the legacy of the women, men, and children who participated in the global war against fascism, particularly the fascist regimes of Benito Mussolini, Francisco Franco, and Adolf Hitler. The recent resurgence of fascism in the United States, and worldwide for that matter, has led many people to recall the heroism of the greatest generation, as Tom Brokaw refers to them, and the sacrifices they made to help win the war. This lecture is also important because it demonstrates the value of the humanities and social sciences in everyday life. There is a great risk in forgetting the past, especially the recent past. It is often said that Americans have short memories. We must continue to educate the general public about World War II, including the Spanish Civil War and the rise of Franco, the 6 million Jews that were murdered in the Holocaust, and the dangers of totalitarianism generally. On July 10, 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily in Operation Husky, the single largest assault landing carried out by the Allies during the war, as more than 180,000 soldiers went ashore. The fascist government fell quickly, and the Allies arrested Mussolini on July 24. The Allies suffered 23,000 casualties, The Germans experienced 30,000 casualties, and the Italians 135,000. When Allied forces reached the port city of Messina, they learned that 100,000 German and Italian troops had fled to the Italian mainland, so the Allies turned their attention to the mainland, landing at Salerno and Taranto on September 9th. Heavy fighting occurred at Salerno. On January 22nd, 1944, the Allies landed at Anzio and headed for Cassino. The battle for Italy lasted 14 months. The Germans finally surrendered on May 2nd, 1945. The Allied casualties in Italy totaled 313,000, including as many as 70,000 deaths. Importantly, the Allied landing of 156,000 troops at Normandy, France, on June 6, 1944, in the D-Day invasion, has received considerably more attention. Through August 21st, 1944, the Allies suffered 226,386 casualties, including 73,000 deaths. It is safe to argue that the Italian campaign deserves far greater attention than it garners. Robert Argentine, an Italian-American from Pittsburgh, participated in the invasion of Sicily as a member of the so-called Bastard Battalion. He spent 3 days pinned down on the beach in Sicily. German gunners fired 88 caliber artillery guns on the beach until the US Navy destroyed their positions. Argentine drove a truck and manned a 50 caliber machine gun. Undoubtedly, he witnessed the horrors of World War II, but he also witnessed the incredible generosity of the Italian people who were willing to share what little pasta they had with him and his fellow soldiers. Albert De Fazio, also an Italian-American from Pittsburgh, was one of 5 brothers and spoke fluent Italian. As an 18-year-old man, he participated in the battle for Sicily. Later, as he arrived in Naples on the mainland, he could not help but think about how his parents emigrated from the same port only 4 decades earlier. De Fazio was later wounded while fighting on Monte Cassino. He recalled drinking wine and eating chestnuts and Italian bread while convalescing in a field hospital. I selected the aforementioned interviews from the Italian-American Oral History Project at the Senator John Hines History Center. In 2004, the project interviewed 40 World War II veterans who lived in southwestern Pennsylvania. And I want to encourage oral history projects at Montclair State University. The history department started a public history program in September 2020. It is my hope that students and faculty will collaborate on oral histories of New Jersey, including the Italian-American experience and the COVID-19 pandemic. Many thanks to all of you for listening, and enjoy the program.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for providing us with some important elements to read the historical context, but also thanks for reminding us about the pedagogical nature of these moments, as well as the moments in which we actually connect with the community, right? With projects that allow researchers and students to connect their activities to the broader world. Yes, to more of this. And indeed, the project I will talk about is an ongoing one and can certainly embrace more students. Our second speaker is Dr. Maurizio Cellura, who is actually a professor of building physics at the University of Palermo, which he represents at the Sustainable Solutions Development Network, which is a UN Environment Program Agency. In that capacity, he has been a guest speaker on our campus in 2019. He returns now in a virtual version, but with wearing a very different hat, which is that of one of the founding members of Memento, the association based in Licata I mentioned before, devoted to the preservation of the memory of the 1943 Allied landing in Sicily we just heard about. Maurizio, prego Maurizio, e grazie di essere tra noi.
Grazie Teresa, grazie veramente dell'organizzazione e dell'invito. Devo dire che è stato un momento importante. Voglio ringraziare ovviamente tutti gli altri relatori per questo diciamo, convegno che rappresenta un momento di approfondimento di tematiche interdisciplinari che abbiamo più volte menzionato. E grazie anche per la tua intensa attività di costituzione di legami culturali, un'attività incessante, una costituzione di legami e di ponti che mantiene viva la memoria in Sicilia, e ti ringrazio per le molteplici collaborazioni iniziate con Memento, che penso continueranno in questi anni a venire, sicuramente saranno molto più intense. Detto questo, Memento nasce dall'attività di sottrarre all'oblio molte delle storie, degli eventi che hanno contraddistinto questo 10 luglio 1943, questa giornata di svolta nella seconda guerra mondiale, quando la settima armata USA, attraverso le sue tre punte, la Joss Force del generale Lucian Truscott, atterrò, diciamo, sbarcò sulle 4 spiagge, 2 Oriente e 2 Occidente, invadendo la città di Licata. Licata fu la prima testa di ponte degli USA in Sicilia, e quella nella quale il generale Patton istituì il suo comando, e da lì iniziò la conquista di Palermo in Messina. Lì è ambientato il libro Una campana per Adano di John Hersey, che fu anche premio Pulitzer. Quindi molte le attività, Licata fu in quel momento al centro delle dinamiche belliche della seconda guerra mondiale, per quel giorno che probabilmente segnò la fine, l'inizio della fine dell'epopea nazifascista in Europa. L'attività di tutti i soci di Memento, che ringrazio per l'intensa partecipazione, le molteplici attività iniziate, tutte esclusivamente su base volontaria, è bene sottolinearla, è proprio quella di ricordare, recuperare, conservare, custodire, approfondire e ridare la giusta dignità storica a Licata nel ruolo che ha avuto nell'ambito della seconda guerra mondiale. L'attività che l'associazione ha svolto in questi anni è veramente intensa, molteplici sono le iniziative, cito molteplici mostre nel 2008, 2011, 2013, 2017, la realizzazione di percorsi museali all'aperto con delle lapidi ai caduti della 207esima divisione costiera, le stele nei siti di sbarco, ma anche molteplici giornate di studio e ricerca con la partecipazione di insigni studiosi di grande spessore, tra i quali va annoverata anche Teresa Fiore, l'intensa attività dei nostri 2 storici locali, che molto hanno contribuito e continuano a contribuire allo sviluppo della memoria. Un'intensa attività di recupero di documentazione di archivi pubblici e privati, un catalogo dello sbarco che fu avviato e realizzato nel 2013, la valorizzazione dei rifugi antiaerei, quale testimonianza di momenti dell'intensa tensione delle persone che cercavano riparo dagli intensi bombardamenti, ma anche una molteplice attività di connessione reticolare, direi, di sinergia con molte altre associazioni pubbliche e private del territorio, finalizzata a creare una rete della memoria che dovrà andare avanti negli anni e che ha come epilogo importante quello che è il sogno del cassetto di Memento, cioè la possibilità di realizzare un museo sostenibile e partecipato, interdisciplinare, una sorta di sincretismo di differenti culture, quindi la cultura del cibo, la storia, la cultura di quel momento, le abitudini, con una forte proiezione del futuro, con in fondo un obiettivo principale: costituire un momento permanente di memoria per il territorio e sottrarre all'oblio questo evento che ha modificato la storia della Sicilia e dell'Europa tutta. Direi che fondamentalmente questo è il nostro disegno e speriamo di avere collaborazioni che noi cerchiamo incessantemente, aperte e reticolari con tutti. Teresa sarà certamente uno dei punti di forza di questa collaborazione. E infine vi ringrazio per lo spazio concesso alla nostra associazione. Auguro a tutti buon lavoro e ringrazio gli illustri relatori coinvolti che ci racconteranno di questa esperienza. Grazie mille per l'attenzione. Direi che sul fronte Memento è quello che dovevo dire. Grazie ancora.
Grazie Maurizio. Thank you, Maurizio. We're going to introduce now our main speaker, who is a historian interested in linking the minutiae of daily life, as she put it, to the broad sweep of historical processes. She's a very prolific author. I have included here some of her main titles: The Taste of Empire, Curry, the recent Biscuit, and of course today we're taking her a little bit back in time to a title that came out a few years ago. But obviously, as you can see, there's been a fil rouge, a running thread in her work in reading history through food. First, as also a teacher of history at Warwick University, research fellow at Jesus College, Cambridge, and now as an independent writer. It has been a pleasure to be in touch with her. And like Maurizio said before, I also hope that this is the beginning of other conversations on a topic that is creating an interesting network of people looking for new ways of reading this historical moment. And thank you, Lizzie.
Thank you, Teresa. So without any more ado, I will get on with my talk. So in a secret speech given to a group of young military officers in May 1942, Hitler claimed that Germany had gone to war with the Soviet Union in a battle for food. Food and agriculture are not usually listed as causes of the Second World War. But food and agriculture, or more precisely, the issue of food security, was at the heart of many of the policies which set Germany, Italy, and Japan on the path to war in the 1930s. Now, I'm only going to talk about the European theatre of conflict for the purposes of this paper, but you can apply many of the arguments I'm going to make about Germany and Italy to Japan. And not only did anxieties about securing a national food supply drive these countries to war, food security was also a driving force during the war, pushing the German regime in particular towards ever more radical policies and some of its worst atrocities. Oh, can we go back to my previous slide? Yeah. So food security was an issue due to a fundamental shift in the European diet. And here we've got a picture of a British butcher shop to show you about an example of all the meat that came in. But first, in the late 18th century, 3/4 of the foods Europeans ate were derived from plants. A century later, the growing urban industrial classes were eating much more meat. In the 1870s, the European per capita consumption of meat was about 16 kilograms. By 1914, it had grown to 50. Now, Britain solved the problem of feeding its population by running down its agricultural sector and outsourcing farming to the rest of the world. In the last quarter of the 19th century, the introduction of railways and steamships meant that transport costs had plummeted. Food could now be grown thousands of miles away from where it was eventually consumed. The food on the British working man's or working family's table linked them in then to the agricultural systems of the rest of the world. The white bread British workers ate was mainly made from wheat imported from North America. The Sunday joint of lamb was normally imported from New Zealand, and it was often defrosted slowly in the shops and then hung out, as you can see rather gorily in this picture. The tea they drank was imported from India, and it was sweetened with sugar from Mauritius. In 1939, 2/3 of the calories consumed by Britain's population were supplied by imports. Britain's food deficit acted as a pump for commerce. The foreign exchange generated by the export of Britain's manufactured goods financed the import of yet more foodstuffs. Indeed, the British regarded the soft white wheaten loaf that they all ate and favoured so much by its workers as a symbol of the very benefits of free trade. In contrast, in Germany, they were eating rye, dark brown bread. Germany and Italy found themselves in an uncomfortable position in the global food system. The First World War had brought food security to the fore as a political issue of concern. During the war, both the British and Italian governments faced strikes and protests over food shortages, and many European politicians, including Hitler, believed that food shortages and the consequent loss of military and civilian morale had led to Germany's defeat. And the picture there is of a soup. So this is a slide of hungry Germans at a soup kitchen in Berlin in 1918. So stay on that slide. Post 1918, both Italy and Germany were hampered by weak manufacturing sectors that did not earn sufficient foreign exchange to pay for their import requirements. And yet the more their industrial sectors expanded, the more the industrial workers clamoured for white bread and meat, foods that required wheat and fodder imports and were a drain on the precious foreign exchange. Italy and Germany wanted to spend their foreign exchange on imports of steel and iron ore in order to build up their industrial and armament sectors. But in the 1920s, foodstuffs and fodder made up half of Germany's total imports. And when Mussolini came to power in 1922, in Italy, wheat imports accounted for more than half the country's trade deficit. If Italy was going to become a great power dominating the Mediterranean region, it needed to address its balance of payments deficit. To this end, it would have been possible to take the liberal route and scale down the agricultural sector, channel the surplus workers into industry, and aim for an integration into the world economy. However, the fascist solution was instead to withdraw from a world market which both Germany and Italy regarded as hostile, dominated as it was by Britain and the US. Mussolini argued that in order to achieve maximum political autonomy within the international struggle for hegemony, it was necessary to aim for economic autonomy, or in other words, autarky. And to achieve this, it was necessary to be self-sufficient in food. Reviving the agricultural sector had a special appeal for fascist leaders as they romanticized the rural community as the source of the nation's social health, while they demonized the cities as centers of corruption and decay. In achieving the goal of food autarky, Italy was hampered by the fact that its agricultural sector, although large, was unproductive, and by the fact that many of the 55% of the working population who were employed in agriculture were extremely poor. Nevertheless, in July 1925, Mussolini launched the Battle for Wheat, and so we can have the next slide. This was a program of land reclamation designed to extend the area planted with wheat, and these are propaganda posters. The program was successful in that within 10 years, wheat production increased by 40%, and Italy was able to significantly reduce its expenditure on food imports. However, Italian civilians did not feel the benefit. The increase in production did not cover the cut in wheat imports. In fact, over those 10 years, the amount of wheat available to the civilian population fell by 14 kilograms per person. And wheat provided half of the Italian population's calories. And of course, 14 kilograms per person is a per capita figure. The real impact would have been felt differently across the population, and it hit low-income groups hard. In 1928, the National Research Council set up a food committee for the study of alimentary problems. The committee found a significant nutritional gap between the North and South. Northern Italians ate twice as many eggs and 3 times more dairy products than Southern Italians. The residents of Milan ate 62 kilograms of meat a year. The residents of Palermo ate only 17 kilograms a year. In addition, while in the north, the nutritional gap between the social classes was small, in the south, it was vast. The committee judged that while Sicily's middle classes were eating adequate amounts of protein and a varied and complete diet, in contrast, the island's agricultural workers rarely ate meat and subsisted on an inadequate diet made up mainly of bread with a little rice or legume soup. Already in 1927, large parts of the population were showing signs of chronic malnutrition. So they may not have been hungry, but their diets were deficient in nutrients. And in the 1930s, 30s, and 40s, pellagra reappeared. But the Food Committee ignored its own findings and used the figures it collected to construct a picture of an Italian diet averaged out across the population, which they claimed showed that Italian consumption was finally reaching the minimum international nutritional standards. Meanwhile, as part of the government's discipline of consumption campaign, Italians were encouraged to eat wholemeal rather than white bread, rice rather than wheat, homegrown grapes and citrus fruits rather than bananas or coffee. The battle to reduce imports transformed food preferences into a political statement. The need to secure the food supply played into the aggressive expansionist policies of the fascist regimes by fueling the desire for empires, which, like Britain's, would provide the resources to transform them into the great players on the world stage. Mussolini took Italy to war in Ethiopia in 1935, intending to build a new Roman Empire. So can I have the next slide? These are Italian troops going into Ethiopia. Once the region had been conquered, Italy sent agricultural experts straight away into Somalia and Eritrea, Ethiopia, to assess how the new colonies could be turned into a breadbasket for Italy. The cultivation of bananas and peanuts was contemplated, and bizarrely, they wanted to grow hibiscus flowers, which would made a substitute tea, which the Italians drank instead of coffee. And this was odd, given that Ethiopia was the home of the coffee plant. In 1938, when Marshal Italo Balbo was made governor of Libya, and Italy, this was a colony of Italy since 1912, he resettled 20,000 Italian peasants into North Africa. They were given specially created farms with the aim that they too would help to rebuild ancient Rome's North African granary. We can have the next picture. These are two soldiers with an Italian settler in Libya. The attempt to create an Italian Mediterranean empire was a disaster. Italy ended up with a growing trade deficit and inflation, and unable to establish productive farms, the Italian settlers in Africa actually depended on food supplies sent from Italy. When the National Socialists came to power in Germany in 1933, they too instigated a campaign for nutritional freedom. Housewives were urged to buy rye bread rather than white rolls, apples rather than oranges. And in both fascist nations, what would have been considered a miserable and inadequate diet in the 19th century was redefined as patriotic. Mussolini proclaimed that the austere diet of immiseration was in fact a diet that showed Italy's strength and national resistance. Sebastian Haffner complained that Germans today consider hunger almost as a moral duty. He described how anyone who grumbled about the diet of autarky was accused of missing silly and superfluous luxuries, with the result that the many who suffered hunger and deprivation did so in silence rather than be accused of greed. Germany also looked to war to provide it with an empire that would make it self-sufficient. The National Socialist vision of Lebensraum planned to drive the Slavs out of Eastern Europe and replace them with industrious Aryan farmers, tending endless fields of grain, which would make Germany truly self-sufficient, immune to blockade, and strong enough to challenge British and American hegemony. Now, this vision led to two of the National Socialists' most egregious plans, as food became a motor powering the escalation of Nazi atrocities. The Hunger Plan laid out plans to divert Soviet-grown food to the German army, leaving an estimated 30 million Russians to starve to death. And the General Plan East calculated that another 70 million Slavs would probably die as they were deported to make way for Aryan farmers. If Mussolini's regime prioritized self-sufficiency above the Italian population's health, Germany prioritized the health of its own civilian population over that of all others. Germany looked on the countries it occupied as a source of plunder, and its attitude towards its Italian ally was similar. As soon as Italy joined the war in 1940, we can have the next slide, Walter Darré, here he is arriving in Rome. He was the German food and agriculture minister. He went on a tour of the country of Italy to assess the prospects for food exports to Germany. Throughout the war, Italy exported citrus fruits, rice, lentils, vegetables to Germany. During the military campaign in North Africa, the Germans shipped large quantities of Italian fruit and vegetables across the Mediterranean to their troops in the desert. Indeed, a substantial proportion of the country's meat supplies were diverted from the plates of Italian civilians onto the plates of the Wehrmacht. A German soldier stationed in Italy was entitled to a daily meat ration of 750 grams, and this would have contained double the amount of calories contained in the normal Italian civilian's daily ration. The German determination to squeeze every morsel of food out of all occupied territories increased over time as Germany realized that this would be a long war of attrition. As the food situation within Germany worsened, they increased pressure on all Western European countries, including Italy, to supply Germany with yet more food. The Italian government complained that the Germans were eating away at Italy. And once Germany occupied Italy in 1943, contemptuous towards their erstwhile allies, completely indifferent to the plight of the civilian population, they continued to demand ever more rice, ever more cheese, ever more fruit and vegetables. Now, Italy had entered the war with its agricultural sector in a very poor state. The fascist vision of modernity looked backwards to a mythical rural idyll. We can have the next slide. This is lovely Italian peasants in the 19th century. This is the kind of idyll that they look back to. This was totally anachronistic in an age when agriculture was moving towards large-scale mechanized farms. Mussolini was a vociferous exponent of ruralization. He argued that this would put Italy on the foundation of a socially stable rural bedrock, and it would counter the sterility and decadence brought about by industrialization. But while Mussolini's government styled itself as the friend of the small peasant proprietor and landless laborer, in fact, fascist policies benefited the large landowner. The small peasant was often forced to take out a loan while he waited to harvest his crop. This meant that he often took seasonal work to access cash. The large landowners therefore had a large and constant pool of labourers who were able to make some sort of a living from the bit of land they had, and were therefore willing to work for less money than they would have been if they'd just been a rural proletariat with no access to land. During the Depression of the 1930s, it benefited the government to reduce the urban unemployed and keep the underemployed in the countryside. The irony was that while propaganda encouraged the consumption of homegrown fruit and veg, it was actually unprofitable for farmers to grow it, and the amounts declined. The drive for wheat meant that wheat was grown rather than fodder, and this too also led to a per capita meat consumption dropped by 5 kilograms a year. The administrative chaos which followed Italian entry into the war in 1940 meant the Battle for Wheat programme was neglected further. By 1943, wheat yields had fallen by 25%. After the German occupation in 1943, wheat yields fell further and they reached about 63% of their pre-war level. Throughout the war, Italy was plagued by the wheat shortfall, which led to constant bread and flour shortages. Even before the war, bakeries had begun adding rice, corn and bran to their bread to eke out the wheat flour. And at the beginning of the war, the leader of the nationalist China, Chiang Kai-shek, had made the mistake of thinking that because China was an agricultural country, it could withstand the strains of war better than the highly industrialized countries. He was wrong, and this was something Italy discovered too. The Second World War demonstrated that the more modern and capitalized a country's agricultural sector was, the better it was able to adapt to the demands of total war. Countries such as Denmark and Holland, who had modern agricultural sectors, were flexible and could adapt. Governments and occupying powers in China, Southeast Asia, and the whole of Eastern and Western Europe, including Germany and Italy, all discovered that a farming sector based largely on small holdings was unable to withstand the lack of manpower, machinery, and fertilizer, and at the same time increase yields to feed a growing army and a huge workforce in the industry. Italy's agricultural output fell by 28% between 1939 and 43. And even if the prices to farmers for their products increased, the lack of opportunities to invest any surplus income they made in improvements such as mechanization meant that there was no incentive for them to increase their yields. In occupied countries in particular, there was no incentive to produce food for an occupying regime. And throughout the world, small farmers retreated into self-sufficiency, which meant they produced less food, and what surplus they did produce, they preferred to channel onto the black market, which paid higher prices. It is far more difficult to exert control over small farmers than it is over large agribusinesses, particularly when the small farmers are disgruntled. Most countries allowed smallholders to hold back a certain amount of their produce to feed themselves, and it was extremely difficult to police the quantities a smallholder held back. For example, in France, the mother of a friend of mine in France, her father was a farmer, and he would take his wheat allowance to the mill, carrying all the correct paperwork in case he was stopped by a German patrol. If his horse and cart were lucky enough not to be stopped on that journey, he would make a second trip and illegally double his personal allowance. Already in 1936, the Italian government issued compulsory delivery orders, compelling farmers to deliver 95% of their wheat crop. But southern farmers in particular ignored this. Black market activity is a very good indicator of how well a country's rationing system worked and the extent to which the civilian population accepted it. Italy's failing system is shown by the fact that once they joined the war, the black market grew. And in 1947, only 47% of the wheat harvest had been delivered to the government. And although the compulsory delivery scheme was extended to meat and oil, it was ineffective. It became increasingly difficult for the government to issue the food ration, and Italy's ration was amongst the lowest in Europe. In June 1942, the average daily ration provided an inadequate 950 calories. The urban population without access to land suffered the most, especially as the people complained that the daily 150 grams of ration bread functioned more as a laxative than sustenance. The bakers used chickpea and corn flour in the ration bread and held back the good flour to make into good bread to sell on the black market. Black market bread costs 40 lira a kilo, pasta 60 lira, oil as much as 300 lira a litre, but a factory worker only earned about 200 lira a week. When in 1944, the agricultural minister Eduardo Moroni begged Germany to send a delivery of grain or at least some trucks so the food could be transported to the city, his pleas fell on deaf ears. And all over Europe, people from the cities would travel out into the countryside and barter their household goods for food. And in Germany, this was called hamstern. So like hamsters, people would who stuff their cheeks with food and then carry it back to their holes. People would go out into the countryside, swap their Persian rugs and carry the food back to their homes. By 1943, a contemporary study calculated that families were spending roughly 40% of their food budget on black market products. So we can have the next slide. That's a black market deal in Rome. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of food going down in the black market. By 1945, Italians were making 70% of their food purchases on the black market. Allied ration foods were now available, but a can of condensed milk cost 120 lira. Chocolate, a kilo of chocolate, cost 1,000 lira. And in Rome, teachers, state employees and pensioners were dependent on soup kitchens. Already in the 19th century, America had a reputation as a land of plenty. The Polish term to emigrate was to bread, literally. I can't pronounce the Polish term. Europeans spoke of emigrating to America to put food on the table, and emigrants reinforced this image because they wrote letters back saying they could have meat 3 times a day. They could eat as much suet and sugar as they would have in a fortnight as they would have done at home in 6 months. And the Second World War only served to reinforce this image, and I'm coming to an end now. During the Second World War, the United States was the only country in the world to experience an agricultural as well as an industrial boom. The problems American farmers faced were minimal compared to those faced by farmers in the other combatant nations. There was no danger of an enemy capturing agricultural land. The US had enough resources to produce farm machinery and fertilizers, as well as tanks and munitions. Indeed, and we can have the next slide now, the American agricultural sector modernized and expanded, doubling the amount of machinery and tractors on its farms during the war. After a decade of overproduction during the Depression, they now had a huge market for their food. Indeed, the Second World War became known as the Good War because it lifted Americans out of unemployment and people were able to spend their increased wages on more meat, more dairy. In fact, the consumption of meat among the working classes in America increased by 17%, as well as lots of cheese and fruit and veg. Kids started eating spinach. Indeed, American expenditure on food increased by 8%. On top of this, America was able with ease to feed its own 11 million servicemen, as well as supply food to China, Russia, and Britain through the Lend-Lease scheme. Rationing was eventually introduced in America. Most of the good cuts of red meat disappeared into the army barracks, leaving civilians with less good cuts. But still, apart from coffee shortages and a few sugar restrictions, rationing had little impact on either the structure nor the size of American meals. Americans, however, had the least emotional investment in the war of all the combatant nations. And one of George Marshall's strategies for dealing with an army of drafted men who preserved a strong civilian mentality and felt that their country owed them a great deal for fighting for them was to provide them with generous meals. American soldiers were plied with meat, milk, and vegetables to the extent that a great many of them gained weight during training. The Surgeon General's office went to great lengths to design balanced mess and field rations, and we can have the next slide. This is American troops eating some of their rations from a can. I think it says probably C ration. And the US Army was unusual in that it accorded food virtually equal weight with the rest of the equipment shipped overseas for its troops. A study of US quartermaster operations concluded at the end of the war that food was had been the best handled category of supplies, and a food shortage in any US military unit, no matter how small, had been regarded as a major emergency. Indeed, a subsistence philosophy had emerged, which saw it as a US service technician's duty to provide men with hot, tasty, nutritious meals under every circumstances. And wherever they went, the Americans had more food than anyone else. "How these doughboys do feed," commented one envious British soldier as he watched the GIs feast on porridge and cream and peaches, white bread and jam, pancakes and syrups, bacon and pucker coffee. As the North African campaign drew to an end and the Allies prepared to invade Sicily, the US Subsistence Research Laboratory issued the men with a new ration pack known as the 5-in-1. And this contained tins of roast meat, roast beef, meatballs and spaghetti, canned bacon, dehydrated potatoes, vegetable soup, dried milk, cabbage flakes, which I have to say the troops usually threw away, and a tomato juice cocktail. And these were the ration packs the Americans brought in to hungry Italy, where the basic ration by that point provided a measly 665 calories. As one Italian worker commented, "Not enough to live on and not enough to die on." Infant mortality had risen to 438 per 1,000 live births. Now today, the country with the worst mortality rate is Afghanistan, and that's 104 to the 438 of the Italy in the Second World War. Malnutrition and tuberculosis had reached epidemic proportions among Italian children. And even though UNRWA, the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, was bringing in food to help alleviate the situation, half of it was disappearing onto the black market. Wherever the Americans fought, they left behind them a trail of discarded ration containers. They got bored with their rations and threw them away uneaten. And indeed, this was such a problem because enemy reconnaissance planes would look out for the glint of metal as they flew over and find their bivouacs and dugouts. So in the end, the Americans had to paint ration cans green so they wouldn't glint. But as the Americans moved through the country, Italian civilians would venture out to spot where the Americans had been dug in and to look for the rejected rations. Next slide, please. That's the Americans entering Palermo. So the war acted as a powerful vehicle for spreading the American way of eating across the globe. Cucini volanti, I'm sure that's very badly pronounced, or flying kitchens sprung up all over Italy. The GIs would bring the food supplies to a woman's home and she would prepare them a home-cooked meal. And the family, of course, got the leftovers. fascist propaganda may once have dismissed American cuisine as nothing more than meals thrown together from a collection of canned goods, but now Italians acquired a taste for tinned foodstuffs, even though everything tasted, even the spaghetti, strangely of sugar. The economic resources of the US, which had been so powerfully demonstrated by the firepower at the disposal of their soldiers, was now made manifest to the defeated Europeans by their bountiful supplies of food. In shabby, war-torn Europe, US bases stood out as islands of affluence. The impressive physique of the GIs contrasted with the grubby, malnourished bodies of the Europeans, and indeed the thousands and thousands of care packages which were sent to Italian and other European civilians acted as a kind of display of American wealth that was given in charity to the poor and hungry Europeans. In 1945, the United States War Food Administration recognized that food was an essential weapon of war, ranking alongside ships, airplanes, tanks, and guns. Food, particularly American food, the official statement continued, has been especially crucial in the present war, essential to the fighting efficiency of our allies, as well as our own military forces, and required to maintain colossal industrial productivity here and in other allied countries. And the US now was quick to see that in the post-war world, the ability to command plentiful quantities of food continued to equate with power.
Thank you, Lizzie. This in person would have been a big applause for carrying us through a particularly complex period. Fascism and Nazism on the one side, the war starting a very complex geography that goes well beyond Europe. I particularly appreciated your look at the colonies as well, and how the imperial project was an intrinsic part of the conflict. But I also appreciated in particular your constant reference to class and how decisions on the part of governments or even specific military strategies had different effects depending on the type of population, on the sector of the population that they reached. That does not mean that the war or the late fascism in Italy, of course, hungered people to a certain degree, but it did so in different ways. And I say this because this is definitely something that has come up in talking to people, and I'm really eager then to hear what you have to think after listening to the voices of the interviewees of the project. So we're now going to move to the second part. So the project, il progetto di cui voglio parlarvi è Cibo, fame, migrazioni e il mito americano in Sicilia al tempo dello sbarco degli alleati durante la Seconda Guerra Mondiale. Questo progetto innanzitutto è un progetto ancora in fieri, che è stato realizzato in queste prime fasi con la partecipazione di varie persone, in primis Kenneth Browne, che è oggi tra noi, che ha realizzato molte delle interviste video. Volevo anche citare Alessandro Giuliana nella seconda fase, ma Ken ha anche creato le clip che vediamo oggi e ha sottotitolato questi lavori. Il progetto è stato possibile grazie ai fondi Inserra e anche della famiglia Angelo e Mary Cali. Voglio però ringraziare quelle persone che hanno aiutato in maniera formale, ma non per questo altrettanto preziosa. I loro nomi sono qui: Carmela Zangara, Arturo Cambiano, Fabrizia Lanza, Massimo Engiaimo, Giuseppina Torregrossa, Sandra Labiso, Angela Agnello, Gianna Gallas e Lia Commendatore, che hanno fornito i contatti con le persone che abbiamo intervistato a livello locale, contatti importanti perché si tratta di persone molto anziane. Next slide. La matrice del progetto è legata al mio studio più ampio sulle migrazioni italiane all'estero, in particolare negli Stati Uniti, così come del colonialismo e dell'immigrazione odierna in Italia, che sono fenomeni che leggo in maniera incrociata per proporre una nuova interpretazione dell'Italia come luogo di mobilità. Questo lavoro si è realizzato con un libro del 2017, Preoccupied Spaces, che ho il piacere di dirvi uscirà presto, spero prima dell'estate, in italiano con Le Monnier Mondadori. Perché menziono questo? Perché gli studi sull'emigrazione italiana negli Stati Uniti abbracciano anche il capitolo del ruolo dei discendenti italo-americani nella Seconda Guerra Mondiale. Un ruolo strategico militare voluto dal governo statunitense perché delle truppe nemiche che arrivarono in un paese fascista potessero essere viste come amici, potessero essere viste come parenti. E parenti lo erano. Il legame era forte tra la Sicilia e gli Stati Uniti, l'Italia per estensione, proprio come frutto di quella lunga e complessa emigrazione italiana negli Stati Uniti. Next slide. La seconda matrice del progetto è di natura letteraria. La lettura di una novella di Leonardo Sciascia intitolata La zia d'America ha prodotto in me un interesse particolare verso il tema dello sbarco degli americani in Sicilia e mi ha permesso di farlo attraverso la mia lente disciplinare, che è quella appunto culturale. Non sono una storica di formazione, ma ovviamente mi aggancio costantemente allo studio degli storici. Nel caso di questo racconto, ed è questo il valore aggiunto degli studi interdisciplinari, troviamo un testo scritto dalla sapiente penna di Leonardo Sciascia che in maniera molto sagace ci racconta della guerra e dell'emigrazione e lo fa attraverso le pratiche alimentari. Il cibo come scambio, il cibo come valore, il cibo come simbolo, il cibo che manca, il cibo desiderato. Il racconto che passa attraverso gli occhi di un piccolo siciliano, probabilmente Leonardo Sciascia stesso, è incentrato sul microcosmo di una famiglia, all'interno della quale ci sono opinioni politiche divergenti, pro-fasciste e antifasciste, e anche indifferenti. Guardando a questo nucleo familiare, Leonardo Sciascia guarda un po' alla Sicilia, guarda un po' all'Italia. E in tutto questo gli Stati Uniti, l'America come si chiamava, no? Con l'articolo che diventa parte del nome, è da un lato un nemico, da un punto di vista strettamente militare, è però un liberatore desiderato, agognato, ma è anche la casa dei parenti, come dicevamo prima, una sorta di Sicilia, una sorta di appendice della Sicilia, una Sicilia altrove. E ovviamente è la terra dell'abbondanza in base a quel mito che sempre ha fatto da magnete per l'emigrazione e che gli emigrati stessi hanno nutrito e acuito nel tempo. Next slide. Un esempio proprio tratto dal racconto, Lydia, there's a second part to this slide, thank you. Qui parla il piccolo narratore. Aspettavo anch'io gli americani, dice quando appunto si aspetta, si attende l'arrivo delle truppe. Mia madre mi raccontava dell'America, che c'era una sua sorella ricca e con uno storo grande e aveva 4 figli e uno già grande che poteva essere tra quei soldati che aspettavamo. E l'America era per me lo storo grande di mia zia, che era una bottega quanto la piazza del castello, piena di cose buone, di vestiti e caffè e tocchi di carne, e il figlio di mia zia soldato che si portava dietro di quelle buone cose e certo era bravo a fare i fight. E qui vedete come c'è un sapientissimo uso della lingua, con parole che sposano l'italiano e l'inglese, store che diventa storo, fight che vuol dire lotta, scritto con la resa fonetica italiana, fight. Next slide. La lettura di questo racconto ha suscitato in me tante domande. Sciascia ci racconta cosa mangiavano e cosa non mangiavano questi siciliani, ma mi sono chiesta, era veramente così? È stato un po' frutto della fantasia di Sciascia o in effetti, come spesso accadeva, si documentava parlando con le persone? Cosa mangiavano e cosa non mangiavano i siciliani durante l'ultima parte del fascismo, la guerra, e poi cosa portarono gli americani. La seconda parte del racconto è dedicata infatti al periodo post bellico e fa riferimento alla visita della famosa zia d'America che arriva con tutta la sua generosità ma anche la sua arroganza, e Sciascia non manca mai di utilizzare la sua sottile ironia. L'altra domanda è: la disponibilità di cibo era effettivamente limitata per tutti o forse questa Sicilia così affamata era anche un modo per gli americani di intensificare la propria propaganda e di presentarsi come coloro che sfamarono una popolazione in ginocchio? O forse era anche la Sicilia a percepirsi come più affamata di quanto non fosse nel paragonarsi alla terra dell'abbondanza con i fiumi di latte e di miele, che era sempre l'immagine di questa America lontana. Next slide. Next click. Il progetto che quindi si è andato formando intorno a queste domande è diventato un modo per incontrare una ventina di persone tra Agrigento e Palermo, incluse le province Licata e Valle d'Olmo, ma anche Gela in provincia di Caltanissetta, altro luogo dove arrivarono le truppe degli alleati quel 10 luglio. Next, you can have all the clicks for this one, Lydia. Si tratta di donne e di uomini con ricordi diretti, sono stati testimoni oculari dello sbarco, in età molto diverse, alcuni piccolissimi, forse troppo piccoli per pensare che si trattasse di memorie dirette, ad eccezione di 2 voci che desideravamo ascoltare, la dottoressa Zangara e lo chef Pino Cuttaia per i suoi interessi anche storici nel mondo della gastronomia. E l'obiettivo finale di questo progetto al momento è quello di un sito web con video, testi e immagini che trovate al link qui sopra tinyurl.com/foodww2. potete cliccare su il bottone rosso che dice Video Interviews per vedere le video interviste. Next slide. Adesso vorrei lasciar parlare le persone che abbiamo intervistato. Si tratta di clip molto brevi che ho organizzato tematicamente. Parto con un contrasto, come tanti dei contrasti che abbiamo riscontrato, tra da un lato la documentazione, il ricordo della fame, addirittura la fame terribile che lascia immaginare il cibo, vengono in mente pagine di Primo Levi, e dall'altro invece una condizione di benessere, tutto questo per ragioni legate ovviamente all'estrazione sociale, persino in un momento in cui il cibo era razionato o era disponibile solo nel mercato nero. Vi lascio quindi con una prima selezione di video. We can start, Lydia, with a few videos.
Quando mi ricordo quando io giocavo, che avevo, non so, 5, 6 anni, 7 anni, giocavo con i bambini, mamma fame c'ho, vieni mamma, vieni. E mi dava un pezzetto di pane qua e un pezzetto di pane qua. E mi diceva questo è formaggio e questo è pane, per scherzare però. E io ci credevo e facevo quello il pane e quello il formaggio.
Il pane c'era, il pane nostro era buono, sempre buono è stato. No, e poi mio padre, con la cosa che aveva lui, non ci faceva mai mancare niente, di qualsiasi cosa, di qualsiasi tipo.
Nella mia famiglia abbastanza bene, perché quando ci sono i soldi c'è tutto e quindi insomma fame non ce n'era a casa mia. Mio papà aveva certamente amici, non mancava la farina, non mancava pasta, il pane si faceva in casa e quindi però c'erano persone che mangiavano quello che passava, il pane nero, la pasta nera, ma brutta. In campagna avevamo le galline, la pecorella, la capretta che ci dava il latte. Poi quando ci sono i soldi, amicizia, non manca niente. Il fratello di mio papà aveva il tabacchino e quindi nemmeno per fumarsi avevamo, diciamo, difficoltà.
Le condizioni di vita delle nostre popolazioni erano condizioni di vita molto elementari. Durante la guerra c'erano i disagi, le racconto un piccolo episodio. È anni 30 e primi anni 40. A San Cataldo c'era una salumeria che non era salumeria perché vendeva solo sarde salate. Il proprietario di questa salumeria la sera si metteva, il pomeriggio si metteva davanti a questa bottega con un barrile dove erano sistemate queste sarde salate. E allora bagniava sarde all'acqua di Colonia. Io me lo ricordo ancora, ce l'ho ancora nelle orecchie. Sarde all'acqua di Colonia, 21 sarde e una lira. Quindi un capo di famiglia che aveva 7-8 figli, passava di là, comprava con una lira, comprava 21 sarde. E 21 sarde era la cena per tutta la famiglia. La differenza di classe c'era, perché c'erano i cosiddetti borghesi, no? Che avevano un pezzo di terra. Il resto della popolazione, la carne, la mangiava solo per Natale e per Pasqua. A casa mia, che avevamo, diciamo, essendo mio padre appuntato dei carabinieri, avevamo uno stipendio fisso, eccetera, la carne si mangiava 2 volte alla settimana, si mangiava il giovedì e la domenica. I 200 grammi di pane che veniva distribuito non era pane fatto di grano, ma era pane fatto col gran turco, giallo, quindi la farina, o addirittura di segala, pane nero, a cui noi non eravamo abituati, a parte il fatto, ripeto, che era insufficiente la razione. La cosa più intelligente, ecco, tra virgolette, che fecero gli americani, fecero arrivare delle navi, le famose Liberty, cariche di farina bianca. La popolazione considerò lo sbarco non tanto come una liberazione, perché noi parliamo di guerra e liberazione, la considerava come la fine della guerra. Non era la pace, era la fine della guerra, questo è il punto. Soprattutto la fine dei disagi, sia provocati dai bombardamenti e sia provocati anche dal razionamento, perché ripeto, quello che veniva distribuito tra pane, pasta, olio, zucchero, farina, eccetera, eccetera, era assolutamente insufficiente. Le condizioni di vita del nostro...
Lydia. So, come potete vedere da queste brevi clip, abbiamo esperienze molto diverse a seconda della classe sociale, ma la domanda qui ovviamente è anche quanto la memoria è stata in qualche modo, in un certo senso, rivista dopo tanto tempo, e quanto ovviamente il racconto sia anche in parte costruito. Ma quello che colpisce è sicuramente la diversità dell'esperienza in base alla classe sociale. Il secondo set di clip che voglio condividere è quello dell'arrivo delle truppe, che è un arrivo militare ufficialmente, ma diventa, come ha già in qualche modo anticipato il professor Allotta, è anche un arrivo alimentare, è uno sbarco di cibi. Next, Lydia, we can show the video clips.
Qual è stata la mia meraviglia quando ho visto quel mare tutto nero, tutti questi zatteroni che uscivano, camminavano in mezzo all'acqua e uscivano sulla terraferma e si chiamavano di qua e guarda che cosa, mamma mia, meraviglia! Questa è la prima meraviglia che è stata.
Ricordo che dicevano che quando arrivavano le navi addirittura si legavano le calze, cioè i pantaloni, per far sì che diventavano sacco e mettevano, e per cui persone che magari quasi non riuscivano a camminare, talmente tanta roba avevano addosso, no? Perché diventava proprio lo sbarco, non era solo uno sbarco americano, ma era anche uno sbarco di cibi.
Questo arrivo dei cibi, che ovviamente desta meraviglia, così come l'arrivo di tutte le navi che sono state descritte all'inizio di questo incontro, provoca delle reazioni molto diverse. Sono dei cibi da un lato desiderati e quindi abbracciati, ma dall'altro sono anche dei cibi temuti e quindi rifiutati. E il rifiuto è legato a ragioni politiche, è legato magari a delle dicerie e in alcuni casi è legato nuovamente all'estrazione sociale. Lydia, we can watch the next set.
L'arrivo degli americani, vede, è stata una cosa straordinaria. La prima cosa principale, appena sono sbarcati, è arrivata l'abbondanza. Caramelle e cioccolati così a buttarle dai camion. E come se le accettava. Guardi, io le dico questo. Il giorno seguente allo sbarco, proprio la mattina, mi hanno offerto una tavoletta di cioccolata. Lei mi crede? Per orgoglio gliel'ho rifiutata. Perché mi sentivo allora un fascista. Fin dalla nascita avevamo quella era l'indirizzo, la linea da seguire da quella. Poi sbarcati gli americani abbiamo gustato la libertà. Piano piano abbiamo gustato realmente che cos'è ciò che hanno dato gli americani, ci si sono avvicinati a noi, ci facevano salire sulle macchine, tante cose, ecco. Ci offrivano sigarette, scatolette, guardi, latte condensato, latte in polvere, uova in polvere, tante cose, sigarette dentro le scatolette. Chesterfield, Lucas, Philip Morris, Camel, tutte queste sono passate anche dalle mie, perché le ho fumate. Io gli parlavo in italiano, loro parlavano magari in gelese. Perché figli di siciliano che sapevano parlare soltanto in siciliano. Beh, sempre vino volevano, ecco. Drink wine. Loro da mangiare ci offrivano loro. Noi gli portavamo il vino, ecco. Ma era buonissimo. Era una bella carne buonissima. C'era scritto mette con fagioli, era la carne con qualche cosa, con quello che c'era. Anche fino a dopo la guerra ancora c'è stata fame, perché sì, era quello, non c'era niente. Guarda il pane, quello della cassetta, quello ci sembrava a noi panettone, perché abituati anche a mangiare il pane di grano turco, con le tessere, e diventava duro, giallo. L'arrivo degli americani, vede, è stata una cosa...
Così, io sinceramente non le ho assaggiate completamente. Ho visto che giustamente le davano ai bambini, c'erano la gente povera e ci davano le scatolette. Anche nelle scatolette c'era la pasta. C'era la pasta nelle scatolette, non solo carne, c'erano tante cose che veramente mi raccontavano che erano molto gustose. Forse era la povertà che gli sembravano gustose, ma erano buone. Non ne mangiavo perché mangiavo a casa. C'è un principio nella vita, non lo so. Non sono abituato io così. Forse perché mio padre era sarto, era una persona che se la passava bene, perché di origine ce l'abbiamo passato sempre bene. E allora mangiare queste cose, sì, scatolette le mangio io, le vado a comprare, no? Ma degli americani non lo so, per me era un'offesa. No alla qualità, per me non andavano queste cose. Forse le caramelle l'ho prese, i cioccolatini l'ho prese, ma prendere la scatoletta per me era un'offesa. Così,
Next one, Lydia.
Per noi era una novità. Scatolame i fagioli con la carne e poi a scuola davano il formaggio che era quasi arancione, diciamo. Davano tante cose, il pane bianco, ma bianco, che era meraviglioso. In Sicilia non c'erano queste cose che distribuivano gli americani e quindi erano ben accettate. All'inizio c'era un pochino di paura perché non conoscendo le persone certamente si dubitava, ma poi altro che accettavano con la fame che c'era, la paura che cibi variati magari, non conoscendole magari facevano schifo, invece no, poi erano piacevoli.
Chi sapeva che cosa fossero questi chungan? Quell'ufficiale che si era fermato da noi perché aveva visto che c'era una bambina e mi voleva dare delle chungan che noi non conoscevamo. Al Licato non si vedevano queste cose ancora. E allora me le offriva. Allora il papà dice no, non mangiare, mi fece segnale, dice no, non mangiare, non mangiare. E allora lui, mezzo italiano e mezzo inglese, mi diceva good, solo che mi fece con il dito così e poi pu. Dopo di aver tolto tutto il sapore della chungan si poteva gettare, dice, pu, non era caramella.
Come avete visto, ritorna il discorso della lingua, di come questi sono soldati stranieri che comunicano con la popolazione locale. E ci avviamo all'ultima clip che riguarda il punto toccato da Lizzie Collingham, cioè dire cosa succede dopo la guerra, quando questi prodotti continuano ad arrivare, arrivano anche con i pacchi dall'America, cambiano in maniera in un certo senso definitiva il rapporto con la dieta e anche con lo stile di vita. Next, Lydia, it's the last clip.
E quindi poi a poco i prodotti americani che costavano poco, ripeto, entrarono nell'uso corrente. Per esempio con i pacchi dell'America arrivava il caffè, che noi non avevamo questo benedetto caffè così buono, così. Adesso facciamo il caffè, ma il caffè buono arrivava dall'America. Arrivavano questi, oppure i biscotti nelle scatole di latta, che noi non avevamo le scatole di latta e ci piacevano queste scatole di latta con questi fiori, queste decorazioni nelle scatole di latta, che poi usavamo come trofei, queste scatole svuotate del contenuto, oppure le zollette di zucchero per esempio, perché non era facile queste zollette di zucchero, perché se arrivavano i pacchi dall'America ci mandavano lo zucchero non in polvere ma a zollette, e queste zollette erano una cosa straordinaria per noi bambini. Ripeto, il caffè e lo zucchero erano i prodotti più graditi rispetto ad altri prodotti, ripeto.
Thank you, Lydia. E questo mi porta alla conclusione e a questo punto vi invito a scrivere le vostre domande, ne vedo già alcune. I'm going to switch back to English now, and now I will give the floor to Ken Browne very briefly. One of the two students involved in this project, along with Francesca Oliveri, who has helped with the transcriptions. Ken comes to us with a long experience as a student, also in prestigious programs, and with long experience as a videomaker and a lover of Italian language and Italian culture. And he wants to say a couple of words in closing about his experience in the project.
Grazie, Dr. Fiore. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for this opportunity to be part of this project. My story is very simple. My Italian, which was once proficient, was becoming molto arrugginito. And I learned about the Italian department at Montclair State. And I enrolled in a class under a wonderful program called Older Adult Learner. And, you know, that over the past 2-3 years, that has brought me to this wonderful opportunity to participate with you today. I have to acknowledge the wonderful faculty and professors in the Italian department at Montclair State who helped me so much with my Italian, Professors Antenos, Del Principe, Miele, and Professor Trubiano, who actually offered a course in translating and subtitling that enabled me to produce with Dr. Fiore the clips that you've just seen. I think for me as an Italian student, I was reminded, and I think this is true of a student of any language, that face-to-face communication and use of the language is better than any software, any app, Duolingo, you name it. You have to go to where the language is being used, lived, breathed, and get into it. Unfortunately, right now it's very hard to do, but I'm very grateful that this project took place in 2019. And I have to say how wonderful it was and humbling. It was a privilege to be welcomed into the homes of these questi vecchietti siciliani, anziani siciliani. They were in their 80s, they were 90s. We interviewed a gentleman who was 100 years old. These were children when Lo Sbarco Aliato took place, and it was a wonderful experience. We were in the home of Carmela Zangara and Arturo Cambiano, and their home was actually right over the beach, the very beach where the first troops, US troops came ashore on July 10th in 1943. And I would like to just say one thing in meeting this amazing couple, that Carmela Zangara actually was a teacher, and she discovered to her amazement that her students had no knowledge that L'Sbarco, the landing, had taken place in their town. And she set herself to capture these stories, record them, and they became a wonderful book called 10 luglio 1943. And I hope I'm not speaking too fast for the interpreters, but I would like to pass along a message that Carmela said to us when we were there, what motivated her to do this work. Il passato sia di monito per il futuro. Let the past be a warning for the future. And again, thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. And to all my classmates who are here, if you're studying Italian, I love you. And go to Italy and use it. Ciao.
Thank you, Ken, for your perspective. And we are running a little bit late. We're 10 minutes over the time, but I do want, if it's okay for the panelists, about Lizzie, to at least embrace a couple of questions. One that struck me actually had to do with beer. We've heard a little bit about wine, and certainly wine is quite represented in photographs of that period of the arrival of the troops. So I was wondering, after talking about so much food, if you can tell us a little bit about drinks during the war, even if briefly.
I don't know anything. Beer has never really come up in anything I've read about for Italy or France. It's always wine. So I noticed, I loved the videos that, and what was very interesting to me about watching those videos is that they said things which I've seen people or read people saying in Italy, in Japan, in Germany, so that they completely corroborated everything I expected, but they said it so beautifully and it was so lovely. So yes, wine. And in France in particular, the soldiers would always ask for wine and they would give out cigarettes or so beer. I don't know anything at all about beer, so I can't say anything sensible, but wine was definitely high on the agenda for the soldiers.
Yes. And it doesn't look like it was lacking locally, so it became a sort of a local currency.
Yeah, that was something that the Sicilians actually had.
Yes.
Yeah, so they could really exchange that for other goods.
Another interesting question that we got from Diana Gervin is actually about possible forms of fusion that were born from the encounter with the Allies. Of course, I'm thinking of carbonara, which is always associated, with this period where bacon and eggs end up in being part of a signature pasta that now we consider quintessentially Italian. And I don't know if you have other stories. Diana was even thinking about what has happened in the colonies as well around this period. And thank you for mentioning the hibiscus leaves, il carcadè, which remained actually in the normal diet of Italians for quite a long time. I remember that as a child myself.
Oh, that's interesting. You don't drink hibiscus tea anymore, I assume.
I wouldn't say it's that common, but okay. the word carcadè was also quite exotic at that time.
Yeah, because I just thought it was so absurd, because after all, in Ethiopia, that is the home of coffee. So it seemed absurd to be trying to grow an ersatz coffee substitute in Ethiopia. But what was the other question about fusion foods? Mm-hmm. Well, I think I can't name for you, your video, the people you interviewed would be much better able to answer that question in a way. But I mean, my impression is that like these flying kitchens, so that these people the soldiers would bring in the tins or whatever they could get hold of, and then the women, obviously it was normally women in the households, would have to kind of make something out of this, and it was all very unfamiliar and peculiar food. I mean, people constantly comment, and I noticed in the American Aunt story as well, he also comments on that, how everything tasted of sugar. Even the canned spaghetti tastes sweet and sugary, and it's weird, and it's very American because to put sugar in everything. So I think you got some very peculiar people cobbled together an approximation of what they thought was a meal with whatever they could get. So I think you did get some very odd dishes indeed, but nobody really cared because it was food. And they were, I mean, there were plenty of people who didn't notice the war and had access to goats and milk and so on, but there were an equally large number of people for whom, who were willing to, there's a shocking description in Naples of how one GI noticed people were actually digging, they had some kind of implement and they were digging the garbage out of cracks in the dock, between the stones in the docks, because they were looking for something edible, even in the kind of gunk that had been spilt on the docks. So people were that hungry. So, some cobbled together weird carbonara would be fine, but I can't tell you a particular dish that comes out of this. I'm interested that carbonara appears to have come out of
it. Certainly what you describe about the desperation is something that is linked to Naples. The situation in Naples was very, very desperate.
It was particularly bad there.
And but what I have been able to gather so far does not give that type of extreme condition. And also in the urban areas, such as in Palermo, where that may have happened to a degree, many people had a second home in the countryside, and there was a big exodus, so they could have access to actually pretty healthy food, right?
Exactly.
From the countryside. And so, of course, my project underlines hunger. But as you can see, one of the goals is to somehow challenge the myth of the liberator that feeds hungry.
You should definitely
Sicily.
challenge that myth, because after all, I mean, the point is, it was, even if it wasn't true, it was the perception. And that was the perception that created it. And also, a lot of the food that UNRWA were, the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration were giving out after the war, straight up. This is after the Americans have kind of moved up and sort of left Sicily and moved up into Germany. Is, you remember, this is Britain. Britain has to ration bread and potatoes for the first time, that they had never rationed during the war, because they have to ship their wheat to occupied Europe and liberated Europe, because the Americans renege on their deals and feed their wheat to pigs and chickens in America so that Americans can have good meat again. Okay, so the Americans are not these, yes, we should not think these Americans were wonderful saviors who were, sacrificing everything or giving their largesse away. No, and they like to promote that, and they definitely were that in comparison to those poor people, but they weren't necessarily the heroes and good guys in the way that they were giving the largesse. They were willing to sacrifice anything for themselves.
Right, and also the system was not as efficient, for example, in terms of provision of wheat. So you're right, and this comes to the surface, like other stories that we could not include here. Some of them quite tragic and violent about their arrival, that are not necessarily related to food, but certainly the idea is not to represent this moment as only a peaceful encounter. It was not peaceful. It was another bloody page of the war. And certainly the idea is to make this story and history more complex with the participation of different voices. In closing,
sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, one of the most shocking stories, this is not a very happy note to end on, is I came across in the memoir of a guy who went in, he was a nurse, and as he nurses up an American soldier who'd gone into Sicily, and he described to him how he had raped an Italian woman. And so, yeah, no, the Americans were not all,
this is
it
one
wasn't
of,
always a joyful encounter of giving away
one
chocolates.
of the stories that is surfaced, and that my project hasn't been able to embrace it at the moment, given that the theme is that of food. But again, the goal is not that of producing a happy picture. Although I have to say, people we interviewed always wanted to end with that good note. And I am convinced, perhaps because of my specific interest as a scholar, that it has a lot to do with the myth of America, that in a way overpowers actual experiences or cultural readings of history, and ends up in representing this country as the one that protects, the one that gives. And so this is the prevalent memory, I have to say, at least so far. Somebody asked what we're going to do with these interviews. For the moment, they're being posted, and we will send you an email with the link so you can appreciate more of them. This was just a selection. And hopefully in the long term, we can organize everything into a documentary. And we don't mean to slam Americans, of course. In closing, as I said, it's a complex history. It's a history made up of happy moments, of encounters, of misunderstandings, but it's obviously a conflict, right, with conflicting positions. And since we're done now, Lydia, with the Q&A, I want to leave you with a thank you to all of you who participated. Lizzie Collingham for your wonderful lecture. Thank you, Maurizio Cellura and Jeff Strickland for their contextualization of the topic. Ken, for your perspective as a student and video maker. And I want to remind you that this was just a taste, to stay within the metaphor, just solo un assaggio. There are many more scholars, local as well. Somebody mentioned Calogero Carità, for example, il Dottor Allotta in Agrigento, that we want to include in the future, as well as on the US side. And of course, more voices coming from the interviews. Let me tell you about the next event, which I hope you will be able to attend. It's linked to Sicily again. It's a bit of a coincidence that they're back to back, although I do pay attention to Sicily for the obvious reason that I am from there. And it's a very, very rich place culturally. We're gonna talk about other transnational routes, Aztec chocolate in Sicily, brought during the Spanish imperial dominion of Sicily and other parts of Italy. We're gonna do it as part of an online cooking lesson with the chef Annalisa Pompeo. And if you go to the link montclair.edu/Inserra-chair, you can find the link to the upcoming event or the general calendar to register. Thank you again for remaining with us. It's still a very large group, even though we went over time, a sign that this was a topic of interest that we hope we can continue to address from different perspectives. So thank you to all of you, including the audience. Grazie, arrivederci, alla prossima. Thank you, till the next one.